of a student. I don't know what I should call you a student, but let me put it this way, an analyst of what happens in Africa, because you have done a lot of work for Africa, especially considering that under the last Trump administration, you served as Under Secretary of State for African Affairs. Now, what is happening in Cameroon, I don't think it is new to you. I think you probably anticipated this moment in Cameroon. Am I right?
Absolutely, Chris, and I could not have said any better than what you said concerning the ghost towns, what achievements it can lead to. Because I went through exactly the same thing when I was in Cameroon as deputy ambassador back in 1992, when there was a
Oh,
very
you were there during
questionable
Frundi.
election. I went and looked at some of the polls, including at a military base. And when I looked at the poll results that night, I said, it's all over. I said, Bia doesn't have a chance.
Yeah.
And then, lo and behold, he is declared the winner by some insignificant margin, which to me at least was a total false, farce. And then Cameroon went through the same thing, unfortunately, what we're talking about now. I mean, the Biya regime has done this, I think, now 8 times.
Yes.
Is a highly questionable election, followed by Biya being declared the winner. Then there's an uproar. The opposition candidate does various different things. The government will target arrests of opposition supporters or leaders. Then there's a ghost town or economic boycott, whatever you want to call it. Then the Biya administration sits tight, and they wait until it's all over, and then Biya is president for another term, and then it starts all over again.
Right. So you were there during, when Frundi won the elections, and you saw Frundi declaring these ghost towns all over the national territory. Again, Issa Chiroma is trying to do the same thing. I guess you are saying these things do not result to anything at the end of the day, because the regime is always ready for people to get fatigued and tired for them to move on.
Absolutely, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, what is the point of the ghost towns besides expressing your frustration? There will no doubt be damage. Of course, there will be violence. People will be arrested. People will die. But at the end of the campaign, what is the result? I predict the result will be that Mr. Biya will be there as president again for another 7-year term, which will take him through till he's, 99 years old?
Right. Right. Ambassador Tibor, at this moment, let me take it back a little bit. Are you swearing in? Normally, you would expect the diplomats in Yaoundé to be invited at the proclamation of those results, as we saw. But the European Union wasn't there. In fact, Brussels sent out a statement right after the declaration of the results, essentially condemning the conduct of that result and how, of the election and the results that eventually came out. If you were there, being there, considering your experience, what do you think is going on within the diplomatic corps in Cameroon right now?
Well, what would normally happen is the Western diplomats would talk to each other ahead of time and say, okay, are you going to the swearing in? Are you going to the swearing in? And then they would likely make a joint decision. As you mentioned, Chris, there have been no statements, official statements coming out. Now, the United States is kind of unique in this because several months ago, the Trump administration decided that the United States would no longer be making comments on particular elections. The truth is those statements don't amount to anything. They might make somebody feel good, but I suspect that the diplomatic community got together and decided what they would do.
And after listening to the proclamation of the results, they remain mute. Normally, they will start sending in congratulatory messages to Paul Biya. In fact, we learned that they are not coming in. Biya is now trying to put pressure on some of the missions to send in those messages. What do you think is happening, is going on within those Western capitals that matter, like London, Washington, D.C., Ottawa, Paris? What are they thinking?
Yeah, in that kind of a situation, especially with a messy election like that, there's going to be a lot of discussion in the capital to figure out whether the interests of maintaining positive relations with Cameroon, the government, outweigh stating the obvious, which is that it was a highly questionable election and it was a highly questionable decision, by the Constitutional Council. Of course, as I have said for months, this is exactly, what I expected, because this has happened now 8 times.
Right. So, talking about the Constitutional Council, I don't know whether you saw the footage out there where the chair of the Constitutional Council, the guy who proclaimed the results, right after the proclamation, went into a party. They were all in a celebratory mode, and he actually uttered this statement asking the members of their government to appreciate him for having the courage to pronounce the results in their favor. What do you make of that statement? That is somebody who's supposed to be a neutral arbiter, but he is the one asking for praises for declaring the elections in the ruling party's favor.
Did anyone seriously think that the Constitutional Council is a neutral body? I mean, does that really surprise anybody?
Of course not. Now, the general appeal at the moment to the Issa Chiroma campaign is to get sworn in before Biya gets sworn in sometime next week, maybe Monday, maybe later in the week. What is your view on contested elections and the opposition candidate being sworn in before the person allegedly official winner being sworn in?
Of course, Chris, as an international observer, I cannot, give advice on that. But of course,
Your
the big
opinion,
question.
your opinion.
Oh, my opinion is the question is who would do the swearing in?
How about any local judge doing that? Because we've seen that precedence again in the Gambia. We've seen that precedence in the Cote d'Ivoire. We've seen it in Madagascar, where a local judge swears in the candidate, and eventually the world begins to send congratulatory messages to him.
Yeah, to me, the big question would be the rank of the person doing the swearing in. Because if it's just a local judge, seriously, it would be very difficult for the international community to say, oh my gosh, that confers legitimacy on Issa Chiroma. So that's a very difficult question, and that's obviously Issa Chiroma has to answer that and decide what he wants to do, because I'm sure that, and I'm not a lawyer on the laws of Cameroon, but I'm sure that would be seen in a very, very negative way by the Biya government.
Of course, and I think that's the intention too, because then you raise a pillar of uncertainty upon the Biya's government, and considering his age, I doubt if anybody in the international community, within diplomatic circles, would want to say, let's just keep the old guy. Is that possible?
No, honest to goodness, Chris, again, you know that I deal with realities. It would be very, very difficult, especially for the diplomatic community in Yaoundé, to say, oh, Issa Chiroma has been sworn in by a judge in Garoua, so we're going to immediately, embrace him as the full president room. So I, I honestly could not see that happening because the local embassies would have to get permission from their capital cities, from their foreign ministers, from the Secretary of State.
Exactly, that's what I'm talking about. I don't think any embassy in the Yaoundé will take upon itself to start congratulating anybody unless dictated by Washington, London, Ottawa, Paris, Brussels. That's the scenario I'm looking at, because I really doubt whether any of these foreign countries looking at, considering number one, for how long Biya has been there, for how old he is, would want to endorse him, send him congratulatory messages, considering that that guy may not even last for the next 6 months. And some people say he doesn't even know whether there was an election or not.
Yeah. Well, you can imagine, Chris, you can imagine that with the election over, the people in the regime are already starting to think about the transition. And, who is going to step forward as number one when the transition takes place? Talking about swearing in, of course, again, a big question would be the loyalty of the security forces, because the last thing anybody would want is violence from the side of the security forces. And if the security forces come down with absolute loyalty and say, we recognize the fact that President Biya has been reelected, then, of course, that introduces a huge element into the equation.
And there is one angle that everybody knows is actually lacking as far as military loyalty to Paul Biya is concerned. We know there is a crack, a division within the army, and even some army officials have already been arrested and locked up for expressing views that support Issa Chiroma. I mean, right after the proclamation of the elections. So you find a situation, the army is split. We know for sure up north between Ngaoundé to Maroua, the army will be loyal to Issa Chiroma. That is for sure. Maybe they may choose not to do anything, but to think that the army there will lift up their arms against the people and against Chiroma is just impossible.
Yeah.
So if Biya realizes that the army is no longer fully loyal to him, maybe except the Bulu, the Ewondo, Betty ranking officers, what does the West think about that when the army is divided?
Well, when the army is divided, that's when you tend to have some really horrible things happen, as we have seen in other countries. So the last thing the West would like to see is to see the army divided. That's why the one thing I think everybody will be unified on is calling for no violence, for ideally, when there's this kind of a situation, there should be negotiations between the parties. Of course, you can only have one winner, so the situation is extremely, extremely difficult, especially from the point of view of outsiders, because at the end of the day, this is something that has to be settled by Cameroon.
Well, when you talk about Cameroon is Biya's. He owns every institution there. He manages everything, and which is why you see Cameroonians get very frustrated, taking to the street, destroying property. And when you have a situation where there is absolutely no avenue for redress, because you go to the courts, he appoints the judges. There is no institution you can go to in Cameroon for redress. So why don't you see a situation where the West comes in and say, all right, Chiroma declares himself president and is sworn in by a local judge, and Biya is sworn in Yaoundé and now, but the people are on the side of Chiroma. Let's do some negotiation. Let's get them to dialogue. Don't you see that scenario?
Yeah, here's the thing. The way you characterized it is the reverse of what it should be. At the end of the day, every country belongs to its people. And then when you have situations where you have a government that's been in place forever, and it starts to think that the government, owns the country, and that the people are there to serve the government, which is totally the reverse of what a normal situation should be like. As we have seen in the Sahel, where you had coups against governments, and that the people came out on the streets actually supporting the coups because the people felt like they had absolutely no way to express their own opinions. When government after government ran fraudulent elections, they changed the constitution. So, I have been a supporter of at least the United States looking at some of these coups differently, because our policy has been that whenever there's been a coup in Africa, well, a coup anywhere, then the United States government immediately cuts off that military government, stops cooperating, and on and on and on. The point I have been making is that the real question is not so much elections, the question is legitimacy. Mm-hmm. Is the government in place seen as legitimate in the eyes of the people? If the people consider a government legitimate, then we should be dealing with that government.
So in other words, you would be advocating for a support of the people where the people consider the government not to be legitimate.
Yes, I would. Now, I do not speak for the United States government, remember that.
Of course, yeah.
But I have I spent 22 years in Africa. I've been involved with Africa since 1978. And in my own mind, I have really come to a different point of view, because I have seen Africa, go to now a continent of mostly young people. Unfortunately, the dinosaurs are still in the presidential palaces in a number of countries, and the young people's frustration is just beyond the breaking point. So Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, places like that, where you almost have a popular military come in. Unfortunately, you see them wasting that popularity, but the people initially were in favor of those governments because they had no other way to express their willingness.
So this is the question. In a situation where the foreign governments, of course, we're talking of the US, the UK, France, Canada, and stuff. In a situation where they say, well, where the people have no recourse, and the US, the UK, Canada, Paris, Brussels. In the situation, they don't want to stop. They cannot. They don't want to say something. They don't want to intervene. What is it expected? Chaos, as we see in Cameroon now?
Yeah, if you remember, Chris, even in 1992, messy election, the ghost towns went on, if I remember, for months.
Yeah.
Douala was basically out of control of the government. But every single government, even the United States, which was very unhappy with Biya, continued to deal with the Biya government because Biya was in the presidential palace and the government was functioning. It would be extremely unusual, and I have to underline that if Issa Chiroma takes the pledge of the presidential office, for governments to say, we're going to start dealing with Issa Chiroma as the president. I'm just telling you how it is realistically. Not how, not my preference, but that's just how it operates.
But they did so in Madagascar. I remember in Madagascar, Rajolina Andri escaped to the neighborhoods, and he was sworn in. The incumbent president left power eventually, but before that happened, immediately that happened, the U.S. pulled out military support, the U.K. and all those countries. But given time, months after, Rajolina Andri was recognized as legitimate president of Madagascar. So the point I'm trying to make is, doesn't time play into these things where eventually the West say, what choice do we have? Let us acknowledge this guy.
Time is the critical element, as you say. It depends on what happens over time. As you saw in Madagascar, the president in place actually fled the country because there was such an uproar against him. You know, we're now talking about Generation Z, flexing its power around the world. We saw it, I think, in Bangladesh. We saw it in Madagascar. We're seeing it in some other places. And it's a real force to be reckoned with. And again, it's presidents and heads of state who are totally out of touch with their people, and the young people have come to a point where is in that famous American movie Network, where the people go out on the street and they say, we're mad as hell and we're not going to take it anymore.
Right. I mean, another example that you will look at is Burkina Faso, where the military took over. And the people embrace it. The people are happier, and but you still find a situation where the French and countries in the West do not want to recognize Ibrahim Traore, despite all that he is doing for people, for his people, rebuilding the country in a way that no administration in that country has. And yet, years after, some Western countries still do not want to recognize him. What do they want? Dictatorships in Africa?
Yeah, Chris, you asked that $1 million question. And again, I say I'm not speaking for the U.S. government. That's why my focus is on legitimacy, because elections don't necessarily equal legitimacy, as we all know from example after example after example. So what can the people do? The people can either go out on the streets in their massive millions and the politicians flee, or as happened in Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, the army basically says enough is enough, goodbye.
Well, we hope that that happens in Cameroon, and for once, the people have a leader who can listen to them. Any advice you would give to Issa Chiroma, the people of Cameroon, in this picture, Ambassador, before I let you go?
The only thing I can say, Chris, again, it's not for outsiders to give advice, but I do have to say that I was impressed with the speeches that Issa Chiroma made in English.
Okay.
I doubt if President Biya can say 100 words in English after having been in power forever and ever. But Issa Chiroma's speech, especially the most recent one he gave, was extremely impressive. And I was sitting there saying, wow, finally somebody who can speak both of the languages.
The only problem is Ambazonians, Southern Cameroonians. We still see him as a Cameroonian, not the president of Ambazonia. That is a problem.
Yeah, well, but Chris, there are English speakers throughout all of Cameroon, not just in Ambazonia, and that's why I said that Cameroon has 2 official languages, and it's wonderful to hear a high level leaders using both of those languages.
No, you are right. And talking about Biya, no, listen, Biya speaks English. In fact, I have listened to him made whole speeches in English. I don't know when that was, but that was a long time ago. It is not that Biya cannot speak English. He just doesn't want to, for the fact that nobody should think that Cameroon is French and English. They always want to portray Cameroon as a francophone country. That is why you will not hear a smidgen of English coming out of Biya in situations like this.
And you know, Chris, I'll leave you because I know you have your program. But in Canada, it would be unheard of for any Canadian leader to not give half of every single speech in English and French, even though the Francophones in Canada represent a small minority, like the Anglophones, do in Cameroon. So anyway, there are much better ways of doing this. But you're absolutely right. And then we know we've talked so many times about how English speakers have been suppressed and made into second and third class citizens.